in my last video, we discussed the motion hearing that occurred in the Karen Reed case just this week. So in case you haven't seen that yet, definitely go check that out because it really breaks down every different part of the motions, what the prosecution is seeking, and we broke it down step by step. Now, one of the things that we talked about was the motion that Hank Brennan filed to get the call logs of Karen Reed's parents, her father, William Reed, her mother, Janet Reed. He wants to get the call logs going back a month before this incident. Now, he just wants the call logs. That's all he wants. He doesn't want any more information. He just wants to see who was calling Janet Reed and William Reed up to a month before this incident. Why does he want that? Well, his argument was that he wants to make the argument to the jury that the fact that Karen Reed was calling her parents at 1 o'clock in the morning is very strange behavior for her. This is not a pattern or practice that she normally has, that she just calls her parents at 1 o'clock in the morning to talk about the day. And the only way that he can show that is by showing call logs that you show Karen Reed's number and you see this is her number. Let's see if we can find it in the call logs going a month before this incident, and let's see if we can find that number at 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, or any time, any crazy time like that. And if he can show to the jury that you don't find Karen Reed calling her parents anytime at 1 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the morning, well, then we can make the reasonable inference that therefore something strange happened this night at 1 o'clock in the morning, or 12 o'clock in the morning for that matter, and that she was calling her parents for advice, support, emotional support, whatever it is. So that's what he wants to argue to the jury. And the only way he can do that is by showing the call logs going a month before this incident. Now, like we mentioned in the previous video, there's also a reasonable inference that you can argue, and this is perhaps what the defense would argue, that the reason why she was not calling her parents at 1 o'clock in the morning every other night is because every other night her husband, or shouldn't say her husband, her boyfriend was not showing up, and he was there. But all of a sudden, this night, she dropped him off at 12 o'clock in the morning at a strange house, and he's not coming out, and he's not responding to phone calls and text messages. So that could also be a reasonable inference that she's scared about that situation, and what should she do in that situation. So that can also be a reasonable inference. Now, nevertheless, the prosecution wants to be able to argue that, and the only way that they can make this good faith argument is that they get the call logs going back a month before this incident. Now, one of the things that I was a little bit interested in, and I mentioned in the last video, was the fact that I thought it interesting that Elizabeth Little was taking such a hard stance that there was no phone calls that were made that night, only after she discovered John O'Keefe's body. And that phone call was made after 6 o'clock in the morning. Didn't seem like there's any phone calls made at 1 o'clock in the morning. Now, I know from the trial, and I did watch the trial, for all you who are wondering, I did watch every single minute of that trial. Well, in the trial, it came out that, no, she did make some phone calls in the middle of the night. So I was just curious about why Elizabeth Little was being so strong that there was no phone calls that were ever made up until 6 o'clock in the morning. Now, we have a very astute and smart audience and viewership here. And therefore, a lot of people pointed out, which is, I'm thankful for that, which is why it's great that we have this community. A lot of people pointed out that actually she did not call her father until 6 o'clock in the morning. It was her mother who she called before that time. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the arguments that are being made in court. We're going to see where they're talking about who was called. And then we're going to play the clip from the trooper Garino, who testified based on the call logs that he was looking at during trial. Now, I also want to make also one other disclaimer is that I only go off of the information that I see in court, in trial. I don't have, if there's other records that I was able to review, if some of you have these actual call logs that were admitted as exhibits into the trial, I'd love to see them. But until that time, I don't have the call logs to review myself and see which one is Karen Reed's phone number, which one's her father, which one's her mother. So I don't have those records. I don't have those exhibits. So what I go on is what I see during trial. And in case some of you are going on other reporting and other reporters who are telling you different things from sources that we don't know about, well, I can't respond to those. I can only talk to you about what I see during trial, or if you actually have a copy of the exhibits, I'd love to see them. Send them to me in my email. I'd love to see those actual exhibits that were admitted in trial. I haven't seen them. I don't know if you could get them. So I have to go based on what I see in trial and what I hear in trial. That's the best information that I'm going to get. And in my view, that's the only information that's worthwhile discussing. So what maybe other reporters are talking about that they have information that they've seen that nobody else has seen, I can't have a conversation with you about those reporters. So let's just leave it to what came out during trial. So I'm going to show you again. We're going to look again at the actual footage from the arguments, and then we're going to look at what was testified to during trial, and then we'll come back and discuss the arguments and Elizabeth Little's posture in these arguments and see whether the judge is eventually going to grant this. So first, let's pull up the motion hearing, the oral argument. So this is where it starts with Hank Brennan. His motion, he's going to explain what his motion is specifically about. Slow it down. Make it loud as possible. All right.
A burden with two of these charges, one being second-degree murder.
I'm sorry, we got to go back.
Start with the hearing, Mr. Brennan.
Okay, here we go. I apologize for that.
The Commonwealth has filed a Rule 17 motion to obtain phone records from William Reed for a 24-hour period. Secondly, the Commonwealth in that motion is looking for records regarding call logs for a 30-day period for William Reed. Although a different motion similarly, the Commonwealth has filed motions simply for the call log for 30 days for Janet Reed.
Okay, so very clearly, he lays out exactly what this motion is about. This motion is about the 24-hour period where he wants a lot more data about William Reed's phone. But what we're talking about today is the call logs. And so he also lays out that he's seeking the call logs 30 days before this incident from William Reed as well as Janet Reed. So he wants both parents' phone call logs going back 30 days. Okay, so very clearly that's what he sets forth. Now we got to jump up a little bit to get to the next part where he talks about this. Here we go.
Miss Reed calls her father and her mother a little after 1 o'clock on the night she struck and killed John O'Keefe. She called both of them, and those calls were unanswered, according to the phone records.
Okay, so he's representing to the court that she calls both parents. Now, that's an interesting position, but that's what he's arguing. He's arguing that she calls both parents, the father and the mother, at 1 o'clock in the morning or thereabouts, sometime around that. There's a number of different phone calls that were made, and that's why he goes on with the motion, as I laid out earlier, that's why he wants the full call log to show that this is not normal behavior by Karen Reed. So now let's go ahead to Elizabeth Little and see how she argues this.
Is already in possession of Ms. Reed's cell phone. That has been reviewed by both a special master as well as the court, and the court is well aware that the Commonwealth has a full copy of those communications. And what's important is that those call logs confirm that Ms. Reed did not make any calls to her father on January 29th until after she discovered Mr. O'Keefe lying incapacitated on Brian Albert's front lawn. And I've attached a copy of those records to our motion. It's quite clear. There was one call to her father on the morning of January 29th. That was at 6:32 a.m. The Commonwealth has a copy of those records. It's in their possession.
Now, she is very strong about arguing that there was only one phone call made to her father. But remember, he represented, part of his motion, that she made a phone call to both her parents, her father and her mother. Now, Elizabeth Little is only talking about the father. I'm going to see more about that as we continue with the video. But let's go ahead a little bit more to where she makes another argument.
Is necessary to show that it would be unusual for Karen to have called her father. And the Commonwealth did a kind of funny thing, right? They suggested during their arguments that she called both parents in the middle of the night. That's not true. There was only one call to her father on January 29th, the morning of. It was at 6:32 a.m.
Now, that certainly sounds like she's saying the Commonwealth did something funny. They said that Karen Reed called both her parents. And her rebuttal to that is no, the call logs are very clear that she only called her father at 23 in the morning. Now, what would a reasonable person, understand from that argument? That she seems to be doubling down that there are no records of Karen Reed calling either of her parents. The only record is her calling her father at 6:23 in the morning. That's where I get a little confused here, because hold on a second. He made the argument that she called both her parents. And she's saying, you did a funny thing there by saying that she called her parents. She didn't call her parents. The only record is that she called her father at 6:23 in the morning. Well, is there a record that she called her mother at earlier at 1 o'clock in the morning or not? Seems from what she just argued that the only record is at 6:23. This is where I got a little confused. Why is Elizabeth Little arguing that there is no record that exists of her calling her mother? So now you can understand a little bit my confusion. But let's pull up what was actually testified to in court, in trial, about those call records. And this is, again, like the best information that I can. Maybe people don't like to trust Trooper Guarino, but this is the best information that I can have, because seems that he's talking about call logs. So let's just pull this up and we'll see what he actually testified to during trial. And besides, I'm sure it's been too long that you haven't heard Adam Lally ask questions. So we've got to do that for all of your interest.
Now, Trooper Guarino, in addition to the 53 phone calls that you testified about the defendant made to Mr. O'Keefe from that 6 a.m., did you note any other calls to a contact listed within the defendant's phone as mom?
Yes.
And when were those calls placed?
I believe there's one at 1:10-ish in the morning. I forget the exact timestamp. There's also one at around 4:40 in the morning, and then at 4:42, right around 4 in the morning. Two of them, the first two weren't answered, and then the third phone call was answered.
Now, with respect to Ms. Reed's phone from that same time period, what, if any, phone calls did you observe to a contact listed in the defendant's phone as dad?
It's the same number. So when I looked at it in one report, it showed as dad. And then when I looked at it in Cellbrite, it came up as mom. So I don't know how it's attributing. Maybe she has it listed twice. I never looked at her actual phone. So this is what the extraction is showing me.
Okay, so if we are going to believe it, now I'm sure people don't want to believe him, but if we are going to believe what he testified to, and he's going on reports, so to try to make up stuff about the report that he's actually, which is an actual exhibit in court, is going to be, I don't think that's a great argument. So let's just assume that he's actually saying the truth about what the call logs represent. So he said that there's absolutely a phone call that was made at 1 o'clock in the morning, and there was also another ones that were made at 4 o'clock in the morning, obviously before 6 o'clock in the morning. Now, he did say initially that seems that some of these phone calls were made to a contact called mom. But then he said, when he was asked about the contact named dad, that it was actually interchanged, that there are some reports that had that number as mom and had that number, and a different report that had that number as dad. So everyone that's really bent on the fact that no, she only called her father after 6 o'clock in the morning. Well, again, it seems from the reports that there was one report that seemed to suggest that she actually called her mom at 1 o'clock in the morning. And then there's another Cellbrite report or extraction, which seemed to be her dad. So we're not exactly sure which of the phone numbers correspond to the parents. Which parent is she actually calling? That's what it seems from the trial. But she definitely called one of them at 1 o'clock in the morning and again at 4 o'clock in the morning, or there was three phone calls made in total. So if that's the case, so then Hank Brennan is actually reporting kind of correctly. Now, he did say he was calling both parents, and it seems that she was only calling one of them. But you can make the argument that, when you call you call your mom and your dad's there, it's like you're calling both of them. You call one of their cell phones, you call the other cell phones. They're both most likely going to be there, especially it's 1 o'clock in the morning. So this argument that Hank Brennan is making is that, look, she definitely called one of them. Definitely called one of them. He says he says he argues that she called both her parents. Okay, so you want to argue semantics? Well, she only called one number, and that one number what was associated with one specific cell phone, and maybe you want to make the argument that that actually was the mom and not the dad. Okay, so then what is Elizabeth Little's argument that she didn't make a phone call to her dad until 6 o'clock in the morning? Did she make the phone call to her mom? Are you agreeing with that? Are you stipulating to that fact? And if you are stipulating to that fact, are then you agreeing, not opposing that part of the motion, that at least Hank Brennan should be able to get the phone records from the mom, going back? And remember, once you open up this, once you agree and you acknowledge, if you're the defense, that, okay, fine, let's say that she did call her mom, but she didn't call her dad till 6 o'clock in the morning. So then what are you going to argue to the judge? You're going to argue, well, therefore, they should only be allowed to get the mom's phone call, the phone records, right? That's what you're going to want to argue. Well, then the problem is the following. The problem is, now Hank Brennan wants to be able to make this argument. And again, this is how lawyers think. So if you don't like this, I'm sorry, but this is how it's going to go. Hank Brennan's going to want to make the argument that you see that there's no pattern of Karen Reed calling her parents at 1 o'clock in the morning. How is he going to try to prove that? By showing Janet Reed's phone call logs, right? That's what essentially it seems that Elizabeth Little is conceding about, because she only argues about the father. She doesn't talk about the mother at all. And that was interesting, because you have to talk about something about the mother. Are you not opposing that at all? You're just going to argue that, well, they didn't show the factors of Lampron. Did she make that phone call at 1 o'clock in the morning or not? Once she did make that phone call at 1 o'clock in the morning or 4 o'clock in the morning, well, then that can definitely lead to discoverable evidence, and or at least it's discoverable, and maybe it can lead to admissible evidence. Nevertheless, semantics aside, the point is that once that you acknowledge and you agree and concede that these phone calls were made, well, then doesn't that give Hank Brennan the right to get those phone call logs? And she didn't really make an argument about why Hank Brennan should not at least be able to get the mother's phone call logs. Now, let's continue with this. Okay, so let's say you say that she does get the phone call logs, the call logs from Janet Reed. And then Hank Brennan's going to try to make the argument to the jury, only having Janet Reed's call logs, that Karen Reed would never call her mother at 1 o'clock in the morning. Well, can't the defense just simply make the argument, you're right that she didn't make the phone call. She doesn't call her mother's phone at 1 o'clock in the morning, but she always calls her father's phone at 1 o'clock in the morning before this. And she always knows that her mother will answer her father's phone. So isn't that a very easy way to rebut the argument that Hank Brennan's going to make? And if you're a prosecutor, you want to avoid that. And it's only fair, you can argue to the judge, that once the defense is agreeing that I should be able to get Janet Reed's phone call logs, I still cannot make this argument, because the defense is going to argue that she always used to call her father's cell phone and her mother would answer, or her father would answer. They would talk from his cell phone. So once you're allowing me to get Janet Reed's phone call logs, then you should be allowing me to get the William Reed's call logs as well. So this is really how the argument goes. And like I said, that's why it was a little confusing to me, how it seemed that Elizabeth Little is trying to argue back, but she kind of limits her arguments just to the father, not to the mother. And are you conceding on that or not? So that's the problem that I'm going to have. Once you concede that they should get the mother's call logs to be able to prove your point, the only way to completely prove your point is to also be able to show the father's call logs as well. So that, I think, hopefully that will button up and tighten up the confusion here of what I had, why Elizabeth Little was taking that type of argument and arguing that to the judge, and just completely ignoring about the fact that she actually made a phone call to her mother. Because once she made a phone call to her mother, or 3 phone calls to her mother that were unanswered, then you're completely agreeing that the prosecution has a point, that they should be able to show that there was no pattern of her calling at 1 o'clock in the morning. Once you concede to that, well, then you also have to be able to button up and tighten up this argument that that the defense should not be able to argue that, well, she always called her father, and we just don't have those records to prove one way or the other. And that is what the prosecution's response would generally be. So that's what the confusion was. I hope I've cleared that up for everybody now. And now it's all clear. We saw the trial testimony, we saw the arguments in the motion hearings, and now hopefully that's all completely clear. Well, that's going to be it for now. Thank you all for watching. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, like, and we will see you next time.